In 2002, a black high school band boarded a charter bus for a championship parade. Only the bus driver returned. The official story came quickly. A tragic accident. The big yellow vehicle supposedly lost forever in the deep, unforgiving waters of Blackwood Marsh, miles off the intended route. For the families of the Lincoln High Trailblazers, 43 students and their beloved band director, Mr. Henderson, the world simply stopped. One moment, there was the vibrant sound of brass and drums, the eager chatter of champions ready to celebrate their state title. The next, an echoing silence, a void that swallowed every hope. Marcus, Leo's father, a jazz musician whose life was measured in notes and rhythms, felt the music drain from the world. His son Leo, a quiet boy with a smile that could light up a stage, played saxophone, first chair. He was supposed to have a solo during the parade. Now, his saxophone lay silent in its stand in his empty room, a gleaming monument to a future stolen. The initial days were a blur of frantic calls, desperate prayers, and the harsh glare of television lights. The driver, a man named Elroy Jasper, gaunt and hollow-eyed, mumbled his story to anyone who would listen. A sudden detour due to a reported accident on the main highway. A wrong turn in unfamiliar territory. The treacherous wet road. The terrifying skid. He claimed he'd been thrown clear just as the bus plunged into the murky depths. He'd wandered, dazed, for hours before finding a remote farmhouse. It was a story full of gaps, of convenient memory lapses. Why take such a remote detour? Why didn't he use the bus radio? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Search teams scoured Blackwood Marsh. Helicopters whirred overhead, their spotlights cutting through the misty dawns. Divers navigated the cold, dark water, their hands feeling for anything solid, anything that felt like a bus, like a child. They found nothing. Not a shred of metal, not a piece of uniform, not a single instrument. The marsh, it seemed, had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace. How could something so large, so full of life, simply vanish? Marcus watched the news reports, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He listened to Elroy's televised interviews, his musician's ear attuned to dissonance. There was a false note in the man's voice, a rhythm that felt rehearsed, wrong. He'd say things like, "It all happened so fast," a blur. But then he'd offer a tiny, precise detail about the color of a bird he saw just before the supposed turn. It didn't add up. The official investigation concluded, accidental death, cause unknown due to inability to recover the vehicle or victims. Case closed for them. But for Marcus, it was an opening chord to a long, painful symphony of seeking. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the marsh was not the answer. The bus wasn't there. His Leo wasn't there. But then, where were they? And what was Elroy hiding behind those haunted eyes? He noticed, in one grainy news clip, a small, dark stain on Elroy's left trouser leg, near the cuff, something he hadn't mentioned, something that didn't look like marsh mud. What was it? Years bled into one another, each one layering a fresh coat of silence over the raw wound of 2002. For many in the town of Oakhaven, the memory of the Lincoln High Trailblazers became a tender ache, a faded photograph in a yearbook. A memorial plaque was placed in the school courtyard, their names etched in bronze. Life, as it always does, found a way to inch forward. But for Marcus, time had fractured. He lived in a perpetual twilight, the ghost of his son's laughter, a constant echo in their too-quiet house. Leo's room remained untouched, the saxophone gleaming, waiting. His wife, Sarah, found solace in community work, in channeling her grief into helping others. Marcus found his only purpose in the fragments of Elroy Jasper's story. He collected every newspaper clipping, every recorded news broadcast. He transcribed Elroy's interviews, word for word, analyzing the pauses, the stutters, the subtle shifts in his account. The official story about the detour for a highway accident? Marcus checked police logs for that day. There was no major accident reported on that highway, not one that would justify such a drastic rerouting. A small detail, perhaps, but it snagged in his mind like a thorn. Elroy Jasper had become a recluse, living in a small, run-down house on the edge of town. Some whispered he was haunted by the ghosts of the children. Others said he was consumed by guilt. Marcus tried to approach him a few times. Once, he'd waited by Elroy's gate, holding a picture of Leo. Elroy had just stared, his face a mask, before turning and shuffling back inside. Another time, Marcus had called out, "Just tell me what really happened, Elroy." The only response was the sound of a window slamming shut. The silence from Elroy was more damning than any confession. What was he so afraid of? Marcus's obsession was a quiet one, but it consumed him. He'd sit for hours in his small study, surrounded by maps of the county, tracing potential routes the bus might have taken, his fingers following old logging roads, forgotten farm tracks. He learned to read topography, to understand the land in a way he never had before. He imagined the bus, not sinking into water, but driving further away. But to where? And why? He started noticing Elroy's infrequent trips into town. The man always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. Once, Marcus saw him at a local flea market, haggling over an old, locked strongbox. It struck Marcus as odd. What would a man like Elroy, with his meager pension, want with such things? It was another small, discordant note in the man's carefully constructed silence. Then a rumor reached him through a reluctant acquaintance who sometimes did odd jobs for Elroy. The driver was attending storage unit auctions. Often. This was new. This was a pattern. Why would a man who had lost everything, who lived like a hermit, need more things? Unless, Marcus thought with a sudden, cold clarity, he wasn't looking to acquire. Perhaps Elroy was trying to ensure something stayed hidden, or perhaps, just perhaps, he was retrieving pieces of a past he couldn't let go of, or couldn't allow to be found. The thought of storage auctions lodged in Marcus's mind. It was a strange, almost grotesque idea, sifting through the abandoned belongings of strangers, hoping for a clue to his son's fate. Yet, the image of Elroy at these auctions, a furtive figure amidst piles of forgotten lives, wouldn't leave him. So, Marcus began to attend them himself. It became a grim ritual. He'd drive to dusty warehouses on Saturday mornings, the air thick with the smell of mildew and desperation. He saw the faces of the regulars, the hopeful, the greedy, the broken. He learned the auctioneer's patter, the quick nods, the subtle hand signals. He bought nothing for a long time, just watched, listened. He was looking for Elroy, or for any unit that might have a connection to him, however tenuous. Years passed. It was now 2017, 15 years since the music died. 15 years of Leo's saxophone gathering a fine layer of dust. Despite Sarah's gentle cleaning, Marcus felt older, wearier. The hope that had once burned so fiercely had dwindled to a stubborn ember, refusing to be extinguished. One Tuesday, scanning an online listing for an upcoming auction, a name leaped out at him. E. Jasper, Unit C-14, Delinquent Payment. The address was for a facility on the industrial outskirts of town, a place he hadn't thought to check. His heart hammered against his ribs. It had to be him. It was too specific a coincidence. The day of the auction was cold and gray, mirroring the landscape of Marcus's soul. He stood at the back of the small crowd as the roller door to Unit C-14 rumbled open. It was mostly junk, broken furniture, boxes of old clothes, a rusty lawnmower. Disappointment, sharp and familiar, pricked at him. Then, tucked away in a corner, almost hidden behind a stack of water-stained encyclopedias, he saw it, a large, old-fashioned steamer trunk, dark green, bound with tarnished brass. It didn't look like much, but something about its stoic, silent presence called to him. The bidding started low. A few dealers made half-hearted offers. Marcus waited, his hand clenching and unclenching. When the auctioneer seemed ready to close, Marcus raised his hand. His voice, when he called out his bid, was steadier than he felt. A brief volley with another bidder, then silence. Sold, the auctioneer barked to the quiet man at the back. He paid in cash, his hands trembling slightly as he signed the receipt. The trunk was heavy, far heavier than it looked. He slid it into the back of his old pickup truck. All the way home, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Elroy materialize, to demand its return. The trunk sat in his garage for an hour while he paced, a knot of dread and fragile hope tightening in his stomach. What if it was nothing? Just more of Elroy's meaningless clutter. Finally, he couldn't bear the suspense any longer. He found a pry bar. The old locks were stiff, corroded. With a groan of protesting metal, the first latch gave way. Then the second. He lifted the heavy lid. A faint, musty smell rose up. Old wool, dust, and something else. Something sharp, metallic, like old pennies. His breath caught. Inside, neatly folded, stacked with an almost reverent care, were band uniforms, Lincoln High Trailblazers, maroon and gold, dozens of them. His eyes scanned the piles, his heart a wild drum. And then he saw it, a smaller jacket, the sleeve bearing the embroidered insignia of a section leader. Saxophone, Leo's size. A choked sound escaped him. How? Why were they here? The shock was a physical blow, sending him stumbling back a step. The uniforms, not lost in some murky marsh, but here, in Elroy Jasper's forgotten storage trunk. Each fold seemed to hold a breath, a memory. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the rough wool of a jacket sleeve, the cold silk of the braid. It felt real, too real. He found Leo's jacket, identifying it by the small, almost invisible ink stain on the inner collar where Leo had once dropped a pen. Marcus pressed the fabric to his face, inhaling the faint, ghostly scent of his son. It was an agony, a fresh wave of grief mixed with a bewildering, terrifying hope. What did this mean? If the uniforms were here, what else was Elroy hiding? He carefully began to lift the uniforms out, one by one, laying them on a clean tarp he spread on the garage floor. There were so many. It looked like the entire band's attire. Underneath the last layer of jackets and trousers, nestled in the bottom of the trunk, was a small, dark object. An old camcorder. Sony. Mid-90s model, probably. His heart leaped. Beside it, a single high-height cassette tape. No label. Could it be? Could this be from that day? His hand shook so badly he could barely pick it up. He didn't own a height player anymore. Who did? He remembered his old bandmate Jerry, a tech hoarder. A frantic call. Jerry had one, gathering dust in his attic. "Come over, Marcus," Jerry had said, his voice laced with concern at Marcus's ragged tone. Now. Marcus drove to Jerry's house in a daze, the camcorder and tape clutched in a plastic bag on the passenger seat, like sacred relics. The minutes it took Jerry to find the player and the right cables felt like an eternity. Finally, they hooked it up to an old television. Static. Blue screen. Jerry fiddled with the tracking. And then, an image flickered. Sharpened. The interior of a bus. Bright sunlight, streaming through the windows. The excited, laughing faces of teenagers. The Lincoln High Trailblazers. Marcus gasped. He recognized them. Tamika, with her bright pink hair beads, playing a complicated rhythm on her drum pads. Kevin, trying to balance a trumpet on his nose. And there, in the background, a glimpse of Leo, looking out the window, a small smile on his face. The sound was surprisingly clear. Chatter, laughter, the distant blare of a practice riff. It was them, alive, joyful, heading to their championship parade. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. Sarah would need to see this, but not yet. Not until he knew what it held. The footage was shaky, amateurish, clearly filmed by one of the students. It panned across the bus, a typical scene of pre-event excitement. Then, the view shifted. The student holding the camera seemed to be walking towards the front. The bus was moving, the scenery outside a blur of green. A voice, familiar, firm, but laced with a new unease. Mr. Henderson. The band director. He was saying something to the driver, his back mostly to the camera. The camera wobbled. Then Mr. Henderson's voice, clearer this time, an edge to it. This isn't the right way, Elroy. There was no audible response from the driver. The student with the camera seemed to hesitate, then moved closer. What was going on? Why did Mr. Henderson sound worried? Marcus leaned closer to the screen, his breath held tight in his chest. Jerry sat beside him, silent, equally transfixed. On the tape, the joyful atmosphere had evaporated. Students were starting to look around, confused murmurs replacing the earlier laughter. The camera operator, a girl Marcus vaguely recognized as one of the clarinet players, seemed to sense the shift. She kept filming, her hand now less steady. Mr. Henderson was speaking again, his voice lower, more insistent, but the engine noise and the distance muffled his exact words. All Marcus could catch was something like, "You were supposed to turn back there." The scenery outside the windows was definitely not the familiar highway to the city. It was becoming more rural, the trees thicker, the road narrower, less maintained. Where was Elroy taking them? The camera panned briefly to the faces of other students. Some were still oblivious, lost in their headphones or conversations. Others were looking towards the front, their expressions mirroring the growing unease. One boy mouthed to another, "What's happening?" Marcus felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't just a detour. This was something else. The footage continued. The student with the camera, brave or perhaps just too curious, moved a little further up the aisle, trying to get a clearer view of the front. Mr. Henderson was now standing, leaning over Elroy's seat, gesturing. His posture was tense. "You need to stop the bus, Elroy. Tell us what's going on." Elroy's face was mostly hidden, but Marcus could see the rigid line of his shoulders. He didn't turn, didn't respond. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. What road was it? Marcus tried to memorize the fleeting glimpses of the landscape. A distinctive curve, a particular type of fencing, a dilapidated barn in the distance. Clues. They had to be clues. The tension on the bus was palpable now, even through the grainy footage. The students were quiet, watching, waiting. A few had their phones out, but the footage showed them shaking their heads, no signal. Of course, they were being taken somewhere remote, deliberately. The bus slowed, then made a sharp turn onto an even rougher unpaved track. The camera lurched violently. A few students cried out in alarm. "This definitely isn't the right place, Mr. Henderson said, his voice now sharp with urgency. Louder. "This is not the road to the parade." The bus bumped along for another minute, deeper into dense woods, then came to a grinding halt. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by a nervous cough from someone in the back. "Mr. Henderson whispered, his voice captured clearly by the microphone, almost directly into the lens. "This isn't the right place." His face was pale. The camera, in its final seconds, seemed to lift slightly, as if the student was trying to see Elroy. It caught his reflection in the large rearview mirror. Elroy's eyes, staring straight ahead, but in the mirror, they seemed to look directly into the camera, into Marcus's soul. His expression was blank, utterly devoid of emotion. Then, the screen went black. A click. The tape ended. Marcus stared at the blank screen, his heart pounding. The final image of Elroy's face in the mirror burned into his mind. What happened next? Where did they stop? And why that look? It wasn't the look of a man lost, or a man who'd had an accident. It was something else. Something cold, calculated. The discovery of the camcorder and its chilling footage jolted the Oak Haven Police Department. The case of the Lincoln High Trailblazers, long relegated to the cold case files, was suddenly, shockingly alive. Marcus, accompanied by Jerry, presented the tape and one of the perfectly preserved uniforms to Detective Miller, a younger officer who hadn't been on the force back in 2002. Miller was skeptical at first, another grieving parent clutching at straws after all these years. But the uniform, undeniably real, and the camcorder, an artifact from a lost day, were hard to dismiss. He watched the tape in a small, darkened room at the station, Marcus pacing outside like a caged animal. When Miller emerged, his face was grim. "This changes things," he told Marcus. "This isn't an accident. The first priority was to find Elroy Jasper, but Elroy, it turned out, was gone. His rundown house was empty, abandoned in a hurry. Neighbors said he'd packed a single bag and left in an old beaten-up car a week or so ago, right after defaulting on the storage unit. He'd vanished as effectively as the busload of children 15 years prior. Was his disappearance a sign of guilt or fear?" The state police were called in. Forensics teams carefully examined the uniforms, searching for any trace evidence, hairs, fibers, DNA that might not belong, that might point to where they had been stored, or who else might have handled them. The camcorder tape was sent to a specialized lab for analysis. Experts pored over the footage, frame by frame, attempting to enhance the blurry images of the landscape seen through the bus windows, trying to identify the route Elroy had taken. They cross-referenced the vague landmarks with old maps, satellite imagery, anything that might provide a lead. The news of the discovery spread like wildfire through Oak Haven. A fresh wave of anguish, but also a desperate, flickering hope, swept through the families of the missing. Could their children still be alive? After all this time? It seemed impossible, yet the footage, the uniforms, they were real. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm, hounded by media, approached by other parents, some angry that he hadn't come forward sooner, though he had only just found it. Others clinging to him as their last hope. He shared what he could, his voice hoarse from repeating the story of the trunk, the tape. He felt a heavy responsibility. Leo's face, smiling from the camcorder footage, was his constant companion. He had to know what happened after the tape went dark. Days turned into weeks. The forensic analysis of the uniforms yielded little beyond what was expected. Traces of the students, the bus, nothing to indicate where they'd been after the recording stopped. The video analysts, however, found something. A fleeting, partially obscured glimpse of a signpost in one of the final frames just before the bus stopped. It was weathered, almost illegible. But after hours of digital enhancement, they managed to decipher a few letters. B, L, A, C, K, W, O, O, D. And below it, fainter still, the ghost of a word. R, A, I, L. Blackwood Rail. There was an old, defunct railway line that snaked through the remote hills and forests north of Oakhaven, not far from the infamous marsh, but distinctly separate. Could this be it? The Blackwood Rail Line. It hadn't seen a train in over 50 years. Most of its tracks had been pulled up for scrap long ago, its bridges decayed, its tunnels sealed or collapsed. It was a forgotten scar on the landscape, a place avoided by locals, rumored to be haunted, unsafe. Detective Miller, now leading a dedicated task force, pulled up old schematics of the rail line. Marcus was there, poring over the faded blueprints with him, his finger tracing the winding path through the rugged terrain. The line featured several tunnels cut through the hard granite of the Blackwood Hills. Most were marked as collapsed or permanently sealed in the 50s and 60s due to safety concerns after the line was decommissioned. But one set of records was incomplete, ambiguous about the status of a particular spur line that led to an old, abandoned quarry. If Elroy wanted to hide a bus, a tunnel on a forgotten spur line would be the perfect place. The search teams, now bolstered by state resources, shifted their focus to the Blackwood Rail Corridor. It was arduous work. The old rail bed was overgrown, often impassable by vehicles. They used ATVs, drones, and teams on foot, hacking through dense undergrowth. Marcus joined some of the searches, his eyes scanning every shadow, every depression in the land. He felt a strange pull towards these desolate hills, as if Leo were calling to him. The drone footage was key. High-resolution cameras scanned miles of wilderness. Days yielded nothing but trees and rocks. Hope began to fray again. Then, an analyst running thermal imaging software over a remote, heavily wooded hillside near where the old quarry spur was believed to have been, detected an anomaly. Not heat, but a subtle difference in ground density. A void, near a section of cliff face that old maps suggested might have been an entrance to a tunnel, one supposedly sealed by a rock slide decades ago. But the anomaly was too regular, too metallic, and it was large, bus-sized. Miller called Marcus immediately. "We think we found something," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "A possible tunnel entrance, and there's something inside." The site was remote, accessible only by a rough, barely there track that the engineers had to widen for their heavy equipment. It took days to clear a path, to bring in the drills, the excavators. The location was a steep, wooded embankment, looking like any other part of the forest, except for a subtle, unnatural flatness to a section of the hillside, almost like a scar hidden by decades of leaf litter and new growth. Experts in mine rescue and structural engineering were consulted. If it was a tunnel, and if it had been sealed, breaching it would be dangerous. The air inside could be toxic, the structure unstable. Marcus watched from a safe distance, a silent, praying figure. Sarah was with him now, her hand gripping his tightly. The whole town, it seemed, was holding its breath. The media had been kept at bay, for now, but the perimeter was tight. The engineers drilled test holes. Air samples were taken. The ground-penetrating radar confirmed a large hollow space beyond the embankment, and a significant metallic object within that space. The decision was made. They would breach. The excavation began slowly, carefully. Earth and rock were scraped away, revealing layer by layer not a natural rock slide, but a man-made seal of concrete and boulders, cleverly disguised with transplanted vegetation. It was old, but clearly constructed. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to hide this place. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began its descent. Finally, with a groan of stressed earth and a crack of breaking concrete, a section of the seal gave way. A dark, narrow opening appeared. A gust of cold, stale air billowed out, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. something faintly metallic and oily. An engineer in a safety harness, equipped with an oxygen mask and a powerful flashlight, was lowered into the breach. His voice, crackling over the radio, was tense. "It's a tunnel. It extends deep. And I see it. I see something. Yellow." He paused, and everyone strained to hear. "It's a bus. It's a school bus." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Marcus felt his knees buckle. Sarah held him up. After all these years, could it really be? The tunnel was dark, damp, and eerily silent as the first specialized team, clad in hazardous material suits, made their way inside. The bus, a standard yellow school bus, was parked about 50 feet into the tunnel, its nose pointing towards the sealed entrance. It was surprisingly well preserved, coated in a fine layer of dust but otherwise intact. Behind it, they found the real shock, a meticulously constructed false wall of timber and packed earth, built from the inside, effectively sealing this section of the tunnel off from a deeper, possibly collapsed network beyond. This wasn't an accident. This was a prison, or a tomb. Every window on the bus was intact, but grimy. The doors were closed. The team approached with extreme caution, checking for booby traps, for any sign of what had happened here. Marcus and Sarah waited with Detective Miller at the temporary command post just outside the tunnel mouth. Every minute that passed was an agony of suspense. Miller's radio crackled intermittently with clipped professional updates. Bus identified. No external damage beyond aging. Preparing to breach the vehicle. Then, a longer silence. Marcus couldn't breathe. Finally, Miller's radio crackled again. The voice on the other end was strained, almost disbelieving. "Sir, we're inside the bus. It's empty." Empty? Marcus felt a profound, dizzying wave of despair. All this? For nothing? No, it couldn't be. Miller relayed the information, his face etched with confusion. No students, no driver, no remains, no signs of a struggle on the bus itself. The seats were dusty, undisturbed. It was as if everyone had simply evaporated. But then came the detail that defied all logic, all explanation. One of the forensic technicians, running a gloved hand over a vinyl seat, reported back, his voice hushed. "Sir, these seats, they're warm. Not hot, but distinctly, inexplicably warm to the touch. As if someone had been sitting there very, very recently. Impossible. The tunnel had been sealed for 15 years, maybe more if Elroy had prepared it beforehand. How could the seats be warm?" A shiver, cold and primal, ran down Marcus's spine. Before Miller could even process this, another transmission came, this one from a team member near the front of the bus. He sounded shaken. "Sir, do you hear that? A sound." Faint at first, then growing slightly in volume, carried on the dead air of the tunnel. A single, pure, musical note, unmistakably a saxophone. It was a clear, mournful E-flat, sustained, unwavering. It seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the bus, or perhaps from deeper within the tunnel, echoing strangely. Marcus heard it too, even from outside, a thin thread of sound weaving through the stunned silence. His blood ran cold. He knew that note. It was the first note of Leo's favorite warm-up scale, the one he played every single day. His E-flat. Tears welled in Marcus's eyes. It was his son, or the ghost of his son. The saxophone note hung in the air for a long moment, then slowly faded into silence, leaving an even deeper, more profound emptiness in its wake. The authorities were speechless. The scene inside the tunnel was impossible, a contradiction of time and physics. Where were the children? Where was Elroy? And who or what had been on that bus just moments before, leaving behind only warm seats and the lingering echo of a song? The discovery of the empty bus, the warm seats, the phantom saxophone note, it became a global sensation, a mystery that defied easy answers. The Blackwood Tunnel was meticulously searched, every inch examined. Beyond the false wall, the tunnel system was indeed partially collapsed and treacherous, but there was no sign that anyone had passed that way. No hidden exits, no further clues to where 44 people could have gone. Elroy Jasper was never found. Had he engineered this whole thing? If so, how and for what purpose? Was he a pawn in a larger, more sinister game? Or had he, too, become a victim of whatever strange phenomenon had occurred in that tunnel? The theories flew thick and fast. A mass kidnapping by an unknown organization, a bizarre cult, even wilder speculations involving government experiments or something otherworldly. None of them stuck. There was no ransom demand, no manifesto, no evidence of any outside involvement beyond Elroy. The warmth of the seats remained an enigma. Scientific instruments registered no unusual geothermal activity. The saxophone note was dismissed by some as an acoustic anomaly, a trick of the wind in the tunnel, or shared auditory hallucination born of stress and expectation. But Marcus knew what he'd heard. He knew that note. The bus was eventually, carefully, winched out of the tunnel and transported to a secure facility, a silent, yellow monument to an unbearable loss and an impenetrable mystery. The case of the Lincoln High Trailblazers remained open, a wound in the heart of Oakhaven that refused to heal. For Marcus, life settled into a new, strange rhythm. The discovery hadn't brought Leo back, hadn't provided the closure he'd craved for so long. Instead, it had deepened the mystery, added layers of the inexplicable. He still had Leo's saxophone, the one from his room. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would take it out of its stand. He wasn't a saxophone player. His own instrument was the trumpet. But he'd learned enough from Leo over the years. He would lift it, his fingers finding the keys, and he would play a single, clear E-flat. The note would hang in the air of their quiet house, a fragile bridge across an unimaginable distance. It wasn't an answer, but it was a connection, a bittersweet echo. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the music hadn't entirely died that day in 2002. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be heard, just beyond the veil of understanding. The loss was a permanent shadow, but within it, there was also a strange, quiet sense of wonder, a disturbing realization that some doors, once opened, might lead to places from which no one returns, leaving only questions and a lingering, impossible song. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.